First, I'd like to express my appreciation to Hyen-Hu van Hinube for organizing not only this specific conference, but for putting together the entire multi-year project. A number of us in North American academia have been thinking about caste and Buddhism for quite some time and have struggled to find venues that integrate our interests in contemporary reform movements with the ancient and medieval Indian contexts. I'm appreciative to be a part of the conference and look forward to future dialogues in person as soon as possible. My entry point into the topic of caste and Buddhism is through Buddhist monastic asceticism. However, I didn't go searching for caste initially. Indeed, my graduate studies, focusing on the legal regulation of ascetic practice within the Buddhist monastery, did not initially consider the question of caste at all. My dissertation was a study of Buddhist monastic regulations of the Duttagunas in the Vinaya. However, in the process of reading through the Vinaya, I found that I was unable to understand why precisely the Duttagunas were practiced at all. As many of you know, the Duttagunas have long been understood as so-called extra practices, a translation which suggests that they were essentially irrelevant, even antithetical to mainstream Buddhist monastic practice. If ascetic practices were mere vestiges, as some scholars have them, what were they vestiges of? To answer this question, I began to look not only at other ancient and early medieval South Asian religious traditions, but even farther afield in accounts from the better preserved traditions of second millennium South Asia. In recent years, I've even been looking at modern subaltern traditions within and outside of South Asia to better understand the socioeconomic contexts that often give rise to ascetic practice. Although ascetic practices do, at some point, become so thoroughly identified with a given religious tradition that their extra-religious origins become hardly traceable, I have found it exceedingly helpful to look to cultural logics, to best explain where they come from. One of my inspirations for this approach is Gregory Chopin, who was clearly reading social science and cultural history in order to better interpret the highly fragmentary record of the Buddhist Vinaya. Here, I would like to set the stage for the rest of the paper by offering a simple but I hope useful heuristic for the study of Indian Buddhist asceticism. Scholarship on asceticism generally falls into one of two categories. The first I will call voluntarist, and the other I will call culturalist. The vast majority of the thinking about asceticism skews toward the voluntarist model in scholarship. What I mean by voluntarist is an elite and hyper-individualist soteriology of self-abasement. I refer to the voluntarist model as elite because the decision to abase oneself is a choice by upper caste individuals who choose to act like lower caste or outcast figures in order to somehow take the religious tradition more seriously. In my work, I favor the second, the culturalist model. And here I go somewhat far afield to scholarship in the ancient Mediterranean Christian world. In strong contrast to the voluntarist model, the scholar of the Mediterranean late antiquity, David Frankfurter, has argued that Christian ascetic practices in late antiquity were generally not adopted due to a radical psychological shift within a single charismatic person. Rather, they are due to a process of communal negotiation, which spread by village rather than by individual. It's a quote from Frankfurter. In other words, the allure of an ascetic was heavily mediated by the needs of the region and the community from which they arose. And thus, as Frankfurter notes, the saint's power was a function of their being there, as the prophets in the landscape, rather than their simply being servants of Christ. Just as the asceticisms of the ancient Mediterranean are a product of regional, cultural transformation, according to Frankfurter, I argue that our explanations for innovations in Indian Buddhist asceticism should not be limited to orthogenetic accounts. My work focuses on Duttaguna practices that take place in the social context of the late ancient Indian cremation ground or Shmashana. Part 1. Are caste-based cremation ground practices masquerading as Buddhist asceticism? The argument that cremation ground practices emerge from a cultural context outside of a distinctly Buddhist institutional milieu has been discussed by scholars of Tantra, such as Alexandra Venta, Ronald Davidson, and André Acri, among others. These scholars have argued that there is a non-sectarian, tantric or proto-tantric substratum of practices and social contexts from which sectarian groups such as the Buddhists are drawing to constitute their own institutional frameworks. If we turn to the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, we find the radical claim that the practices of the Buddhist cremation ground ascetics, such as Mahakala and Kalananda, have a non-monastic provenance. When, in the Vinaya, a group of incredulous monastics inquire into the karmic genealogy that explains why the monk Mahakala is, quote, always satisfied living in the Shmashana, the Buddha responds that in Mahakala's past life, he was a spirit who not only lived in the place in which corpses are discarded, but also fed on the flesh of those dead bodies. In the Dhammapadatta version of Mahakala's life, the moment in the narrative in which he takes tonsure and asks the Buddha what kind of practices he should engage in, the Buddha immediately advises him to move to the cemetery and engage in cremation ground practice. Even more curious is that Mahakala acquires the technical knowledge about how to live in the Shmashana not from the Buddha, but from the Chandala manager of this cremation ground, a woman named Kali, appropriately enough. In her excellent study Charming Cadavers, Liz Wilson notes that both Mahakala and his female Chandala initiatrix share the name of the tantric cremation ground goddess Kali, a terrifying figure who, in a state of divinely delirious rage, dismembers, burns, and even consumes corpses. Considering Wilson's observation, in light of the karmic genealogy noted above, it becomes clear that the Buddhist tradition views Mahakala as a saintly figure but an extraterritorial one, whose karmic and cultural mode are foreign to the Buddhist monastery of late ancient South Asia. Mahakala's cremation ground practices, the technical knowledge required for this lifestyle, and indeed his genealogical affiliation to both the Chandala Kali and the proto-tantric spirits of the cremation ground constitute an embodied experience that suggests that the Buddhist cemetery ascetic is first and foremost the product of the socioeconomic culture of the Chandala. Okay, Part 2. Vinaya regulation of ascetic cremation ground practices as an historical documentation of culture war between Brahmins and Chandalas. In the second part of my presentation, I will focus on a particular passage from the Sarvastivada Vinaya, a case that features the ascetic practice of the Pamshikulika, or scavenger of the waste dump. I will argue that the socioeconomic roots of cemetery asceticism, and by this I mean Chandala cultural roots, are evident in the Vinaya depictions of the Pamshikulika monk Black Ananda. I have argued elsewhere that the Vinaya represents the Buddhist monastery as a critical institutional battleground upon which the cultural combat between Brahmanizing forces and those subaltern communities resistant to caste-based hegemony played out in the early centuries of the Common Era. Gregory Chopin has suggested that cases involving antinomian figures like Black Ananda, who flagrantly violate purity norms, are subject to intense scrutiny by Brahmanizing Vinaya authorities, who have assumed the Brahmanical politics of their patrons. The passage goes like this.